Today's video is brought to you by Trade Coffee. So you're trying to figure out which coffee grinder you should buy, and there are a ton of options out there. It can be a bit of a mess to sort out, but there is one question that you can ask that will set you on the right path to finding the best grinder for you. And that question is, do you really need a grinder with these hoppers on top here that are called on-demand grinders, or should you be looking at these kind of single-serve grinders that are called single-dosing grinders? And it's very interesting when I get this question in my DMs, very often people will say, I'm looking between these two grinders and can you help me decide which one? And very often it's one from each camp. And there are a couple different scenarios where, I might say, oh, it will put you down this road or that road. But there's one big question that I think is probably the biggest predictor on which type of grinder you should end up going with. First, though, I want to talk about how these different types of grinders work. These ones over here are called on-demand grinders. These are the types of grinders that you see in commercial cafes, and when you talk to people about big fancy coffee grinders, very often this is what they think of. This kind of tall, tubular body with this clear container called a hopper that you put your coffee in on the top. And basically the thinking is that you dump a bag of coffee in here, and then it stays there ready at all times. And whenever you need a coffee, you put your portafilter in or use the grounds bin, turn it on, and it will grind up a certain amount of coffee for you. This one, the Encore, just functions with an on-off switch. As you go up in price, you can get time-based grinders that will grind, in theory, a similar amount of coffee over a specific period of time. Very fast, very convenient. There are some downsides. We will talk about them. Then there are single dosing grinders. Basically, the principle is that you weigh out one dose of coffee, you put it in the grinder and grind it up. Many of these grinders are marketed as zero or very low retention, meaning that the internals are designed in such a way where basically to the 1/10 of a gram or 2/10 of a gram, what you put in, you're going to get out. There's no kind of residual grounds left in there. Then the next time you go to make a cup of coffee, unlike these that have the coffee already loaded in, you weigh out another dose, put it in the top, and the coffee is ground for you. Again, some advantages, some disadvantages. We will talk about them. Then there's a newer kid on the block that is sort of in the on-demand grinder family, and that is a grind by weight grinder. And these are very interesting grinders. This is one right here. This is the All Ground Sense. Eureka makes one as well. There are a couple others on the market as well by Malkonig and Mazur. And how they work is the forks have a little scale built into them. And as coffee is getting dispensed into either the portafilter or the grounds bin, it's actually weighing the coffee out in real time. And when it detects that there's enough coffee in there, it will stop. Now, the difference really between time-based and grind by weight is it does get you added convenience even over the already very convenient on-demand grinders because it makes the dial-in process a lot shorter. With a time-based grinder, you need to not only grind in your grind size, but also your grind time. It's kind of a two-stage process. And as your coffee ages and you start to grind finer, then you also need to figure out how to adjust your grind time in order for everything to work out in your espresso machine. And that's because if you grind finer, the grinder will actually grind up a little less coffee in the same amount of time. It can become a little tedious. A grind by weight grinder, because it weighs the output and stops the grinder automatically, makes it so that you only need to adjust one thing, the grind size, making for a much faster dial-in. So basically, even more convenience at a slightly higher price point. Now, there are a couple of caveats to deciding which way you're going to go in this conversation, but generally the wisdom you'll hear, and this very often can set you on the right path, is, are you the type of coffee drinker who drinks basically one coffee and you don't change it very often? Or are you the type of person who changes things up a lot? If you are the one coffee type of person, I always buy the same coffee, an on-demand grinder can work great for you. If you're the type of person where you're changing your coffee often, maybe even you have several bags of coffee on the go at one time, or you think you might like to do that, single dosing grinder becomes more appealing. If you are enjoying a coffee and you want to say, switch to a decaf for 1 espresso shot or 2 espresso shots, doing that in an on-demand grinder is basically impossible because you have all this coffee sitting up here and there's not really a great way to get it out aside from grinding it up. You can close the hopper, lift it up and lift it out, but there's still going to be a bunch of coffee left in here that you got to get out somehow. Not ideal for switching between different types of coffee. So I think if doing something like that or having a medium roast and a light roast on the go at the same time is something that you think you might be doing, I might say actually just discount the on-demand grinder family entirely, unless you want to consider having one on-demand grinder for your morning espresso shot and one single dosing grinder to kind of handle everything else. That can work too. Now, before we get into the caveats of these different types of grinders that will hopefully set you on your way to picking a direction, there is one thing that is actually pretty obvious that we need to talk about, and that is the coffee that goes inside. When it comes to improving the quality of your coffee, many people look to equipment as the obvious upgrade that you should get, and the grinder specifically. By far, the biggest upgrade you can make is actually the coffee that you put in the grinder. And Trade Coffee is something that I love recommending when it comes to this. Trade is a subscription service. You go onto their website, you answer a short quiz that they have on there that gives them information about both how you like to make your coffee and the types of coffee that you enjoy the most. Then they set you up with a subscription that is delivered right to your door, pairing you with coffee that you will love that comes from over 50 top-tier specialty coffee roasters. It's a fantastic way to not only have top-shelf coffee come into your house all the time, but to also discover roasters that are excellent and vetted. If you're looking for an easy coffee upgrade that is actually a lot more affordable than equipment, Trade is something that is really worth considering. And right now, Trade is offering a discovery trial, which is 3 bags of coffee from 3 different roasters, and you get your first bag for free at drinktrade.com/daddygotcoffee. That's drinktrade.com/daddygotcoffee to get started with your trial. Now, the actual coffee aside, what are those caveats that may push you one way or the other when it comes to these grinders? Number one is, I'm going to say, workflow. If you are doing a single dosing grinder, it just is a more tedious workflow. There isn't a lot of way around it. Intense coffee nerds like me will tell you,
it's not a big deal, you do get used to it.
And you do get used to it, but also normal people watching you make a cup of coffee using a single dosing grinder will say, wow, that's really quite the process. You have to get out a little scale and then you have to weigh your coffee, and very often you're going to spritz it with water before you put it in. And people are like, what is that you just sprayed on the coffee? And then you put it in here and then you got to press this bellow thing, depending on the grinder, and you got to mix it up. And then a lot of people choose, well, you're into this anyway, so I'm going to get the little needle spinny thing to put on there, and then I'm going to tamp it, and then I'm going to make my espresso. There's just a lot of steps there. With an on-demand grinder, things get a lot simpler. You put your portafilter in, you press a button, and you have this beautifully fluffy, in almost all cases these days, ground coffee sitting there. You haven't flipped it or done anything weird with it, so it tends to distribute pretty well. Very often you just need to shimmy your portafilter and tamp it and make your espresso. Way more convenient workflow with these things on the whole. Now, whatever you may prefer aside, there is another factor when it comes to workflow, and that is what other people who may also live in your house want their experience of making coffee to be like. And you may be able to get your spouse over to doing an espresso machine, but in my experience, once you start convincing them to get out a little scale and weighing every shot and spritzing with water and then dialing in if necessary, if they chose a different coffee than was the last one you were using, then teaching how to do puck prep, then trying to teach them how to make espresso across a lot of different coffees, very often they're not into that. I know for Sarah specifically, she would much rather stick a portafilter into a coffee grinder and press a button and have a predictable, consistent result. So that is a factor as well. Again, there are a couple reasons why some people end up having one of each of these around. Now, where on-demand grinders do pull ahead in terms of workflow, there is a pretty big compromise with them, in my experience, that may or may not make a big difference to you. And that is very often the first shot that you make with these things very often has actually stale coffee grounds in it. You know, when an on-demand grinder grinds a shot of espresso, the chutes are not really designed to not keep anything in there. You know, it's very common for them to retain even up to several grams worth of ground coffee just kind of sitting in there. And what happens is the next time you turn it on, it just pushes that out into your portafilter. Now, where these grinders were originally designed to be used in cafes, that's not actually a huge deal because you're making another shot of coffee every couple minutes. So, you know, for some grounds to be sitting there for a few minutes and then you put your coffee in there and you're just doing that all day, having a little bit of a higher retention doesn't actually make a meaningful difference. Where it does make a difference is if you're doing 1 to 2 coffees a day and that's all you're doing for the day. You know, your first coffee of the day will potentially have grounds that have been sitting there for like 18 to 24 hours. They'll be a little stale. You know, once you grind them up espresso fine, they oxidize pretty quickly. So when it comes to on-demand grinders, I always recommend like purging a single shot's worth of coffee just to clear any of that out. It's a little more wasteful and not everybody is into that. But it's because these grinders were designed really to be used in cafes and people adapted them for home. Single dosing grinders basically have no retention, so this isn't really an issue. You're going to make better use of the coffee that you have at the expense of a more convenient workflow. Now, where on-demand grinders can really shine is if you are doing volume at your home or office. You know, if the espresso machine is getting used all day or you have big company coming over basically every weekend and you need to crank out 10 to 12 drinks. These things are so convenient. There's nothing worse than having a crowd of people around your kitchen and you're like weighing out one shot of coffee at a time and making somebody's coffee, and it takes you like an hour to serve 10 people. That's a bummer. So these can have a place in homes for sure. It's just a compromise. And one other compromise on the on-demand front that, again, comes at kind of a flip side to that convenient workflow is these things are not really airtight. While coffee beans do go stale a lot more quickly after they've been ground, they do go stale in these hoppers a lot faster than they will in, say, a sealed coffee bag. To the point where if you're really picky about your coffee, I would say maybe only put a couple days worth in these things rather than a full bag of coffee at a time, and, you know, try and keep the rest of the coffee kind of sealed up in a bag as best you can. Again, in a cafe where they're going through a couple kilos of coffee in a day, staleness is not really going to be an issue. But if it takes you 2 weeks to go through a bag of coffee at home, it might be something you want to think about. So how do we put all this together? Because I said the first question, you know, how do you drink coffee? Are you a one coffee person or a several coffee person can kind of get you on the right path. And that is true in a lot of cases. What I will say is if you are a drink one coffee type of person, you know, say you drink the same coffee pretty consistently, you don't really color outside the lines, you don't do decaf, you don't have a light roast and a medium roast, you kind of just buy the same coffee all the time and you don't mix it up too much, you might be thinking, okay, this is great. I'm going to go with an on-demand grinder. I like the convenience. Sounds good. The case where I may still actually direct you to a single dosing grinder is if you are the type of person who only has 1 to 2 coffees a day. And that is because of the retention that exists in these grinders. You know, if you use an on-demand grinder, say like once a day or maybe twice a day, every morning when you wake up, if you want a consistent espresso experience, you're going to need to purge some out. And that loss can make up for a significant amount of the grounds that you go through if that's a routine that you go through every day and you have a relatively small amount of coffee. Now, some people choose not to worry about it and they just deal with the inconsistency. If you are picky about this stuff, you will notice inconsistency day to day, or even your second shot will maybe go a lot slower than your first shot. That can be a symptom of this. And that will be something that you will always kind of wonder why it is. And in many cases, it's because of that stale coffee that has been sitting in the grinder, ground up overnight. So in those cases, I would still direct some of you to consider a single dosing grinder instead. And it's not something that grind by weight grinders actually save you from either. Grind by weight grinders make the dial-in process a lot faster. They still have that retention issue that most on-demand grinders have. So if you're trying to figure out, of the two options, which is the direction that you should go in, I actually have a whole video on this, on how to choose different grinders based on some of the most common options that are out there. I will link to that down in the description of this video. If you're feeling like some of these options are just too expensive for what you get, I would rather just grind up my coffee by hand. I got a video to help you find your way in that one. I'll link that one too. So I would love to know, what were the factors that mattered the most to you when you were choosing a coffee grinder? What did I miss in this video? And what is the setup that you ended up with? I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you on the next one.